Well, thank you so much for giving up an hour of your day in the middle of a busy weekday. I really feel good now. I had this nightmare. I was going to come over here and eat a sandwich with Skip and walk out, and there wasn't going to be anybody here. So, wow, we've been listening to that guy for years. We don't want to have to listen to him again. So I've got to tell you, I am truly, truly honored that you would all be here today to hear me ramble a little while. I've taken off my watch, so I won't go too long, and maybe we can have a little conversation about Arkansas, because that's what I'm going to talk about. They say talk about what you know, and I don't know a lot outside the state of Arkansas, so we'll talk about this place that I have called home for most of my life. I spent 4 years over on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., but I want you to know that I kept Arkansas plates on my car those entire 4 years that I was the Arkansas Democrat correspondent. That was back before we did away with the car inspection, so I did have to drive home once every year to get my tags renewed, and because we couldn't do those, there wasn't any such thing as the internet, or we couldn't do those by mail in those days. We had to have the car inspection. So I even, in those years, kept Arkansas plates on my car. And what was one of these small world stories, my wife of now more than 27 years, when we began dating, she lived in a high-rise over in Crystal City, just across the river from Washington, D.C. I actually lived on Capitol Hill. And I saw another car. It was a great big car. It was from a dealership in Searcy that had Arkansas plates on it, and finally got to inquiring and figured out that was Congressman Wilbur Mills' car. He lived in the same high-rise, Crystal City's, the Crystal Tower, as my now wife did. And Mr. Mills had kept, even long after leaving Congress, he had kept those tags. I bet he didn't have to drive home to have his car inspected. I did, just a gut sense that he probably did not have to do that. But it would occasionally run into Mr. Mills and Mrs. Mills, and that was one of the wonderful things about being from this state of fewer than 3 million people. As we all know, there are only 2 degrees of separation at most in Arkansas. When I was first sent to Washington, I came out of the sports department of the Arkansas Democrat, and I was scared to death because the newspaper war had heated up. The Gazette had a veteran correspondent at the time named Carol Matlack. Here I come. I'd covered the Super Bowl in New Orleans that year as the Bears beat New England, was my one Super Bowl to cover. And all of a sudden I'm covering Congress. And the big story of 1986, some of you may remember, in Washington was the Tax Reform Act of 1986. We were basically rewriting the federal tax code. Well, I said to myself, a natural story would be to go to the guy who wrote most of the existing federal tax code, that being Wilbur Mills. When Mr. Mills was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, they didn't even have subcommittees at the time. If you wanted any change in the federal tax code, you had to come through this one guy from Kensett, Arkansas. Now, you talk about real power. In fact, there's a story, you know, that it may be apocryphal, but I hope it's true because I like it, about the group of Democrats who came to urge Mr. Mills to run for president and try to knock off Richard Nixon in 1972. And he supposedly said, boys, why would I want to be president and have to give up all this power? But anyway, I thought this would be a natural story. Mr. Mills had been gone from Congress for a decade, but he's still working at a K Street law firm, still kept an office, knew the tax code, like I said, since he had written most of it better than anyone. So I made an appointment with him. He agreed to see me. And I went into his office and began to interview him. And I remember that he was cordial, but just cordial, like an interview subject would be, not overly friendly. And then I played one of those Arkansas cards on him. And to back up just a second, my grandfather on my mother's side had been the Prairie County judge when Mr. Mills was White County judge. So they were county judge colleagues in adjoining counties. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Mills, I think you knew my late grandfather. And he said, who was your grandfather, son? And I said, W.J. Caskey from Des Arc. And this big smile came across his face. I can remember this word for word. And he said, good God, son. Said, if it hadn't have been for the votes that Will Caskey delivered me. Now, I didn't want to know the meaning of delivered. They did politics differently back in those days. True story, that if it hadn't have been for the votes that Will Caskey delivered me in Prairie County, I wouldn't have been elected to Congress the first time. And so suddenly he became my best source. And he never wanted to be quoted by name, but if I had any question, his secretary would always put me right through, and I could quote him, but it was according to somebody close to the tax negotiations. Now, how could you have had a better source than Wilbur Mills? And it was all because he had been a friend of my grandfather. One of the many, many reasons that I love Arkansas. I'll take you back as I talk a little bit about how my column came together, and this book is actually a collection of previously published Democrat-Gazette columns. So as I tell people, it's the easiest kind of book to do, one that's already written. So we collected and edited the columns and put them together over a period of about 9 years they go back. But the date I was going to take you back to was a leap day, February the 29th of 1964. I was 4 years old at the time, and obviously one of these things that's seared in your brain now. I was at my grandparents' house. They had a little lake house on Lake Norrell, which is the Benton City water supply lake. My grandfather on my father's side, my other grandfather, had been the city street commissioner / fire chief of Benton during the Great Depression. There wasn't enough money to hire two different people, so he did both jobs. But as a former city employee, former city employees were offered, when they built Lake Norrell, the chance to buy the first lots, and he actually bought the first lot on that lake. I wish we still had it. It's the lake where I learned to water ski. I was a lot thinner back then. I could actually get up on skis. I learned to really swim. I learned to fish. I learned to frog gig, all in that lake. And it was a warm, even though it was a late winter day, I remember it was a warm day, and we were out on the dock. And my grandmother, that evening, I remember saying, "There's Dr. Hogue," who was their family doctor. Ernest, my grandfather had this great name, which really, I think, reeks of somebody born in the 1800s. Ernest Ezra Nelson was his name, E. Nelson. And she said, "Ernest, there's Dr. Hogue. Go see Dr. Hogue and see what he wants." Well, Dr. Hogue was coming to tell us, that I was 4 at the time, that my 9-year-old brother had been killed that afternoon in an accident at Pine Bluff. We grew up, as Skip mentioned, in Arkadelphia, huge Ouachita fans, and Ouachita was playing in the district tournament to see who would advance to the national tournament in Kansas City in the old NAIA. At the time, they were having dinner at a friend's house, and a grocery delivery truck had backed over him as he was playing in the front yard, and that was on February the 29th of 1964. In 1965, the fall of that year, I was going to turn 6 years old on September the 2nd of that year. And my father decided that rather than being about the youngest one in my class, turning 6 on September the 2nd, he would prefer me to be the oldest one in the class. So he was an old coach, and he would use the term, "I redshirted him." He said, "I redshirted him in kindergarten." So he held me back. He held me back. But it wasn't necessarily, even though I would go occasionally, we didn't have public kindergartens then. I went to Mrs. Butler's in Arkadelphia, but he held me back. But he sold athletic supplies all over the state. High schools, colleges, traveled the entire state. Many a time he would leave on a Monday. We wouldn't see him again till a Friday when he got home. And he determined that I was going to travel with him that year. And so one of the most wonderful years of my childhood was the 1965-66 school year, because I spent most of it traveling with my father. And it probably wasn't until I was an adult that I determined that that was much more about him probably than it was about me. It probably was an advantage being the oldest one in my class when I eventually started the first grade and went all the way up. But I look back now and I see that he was just a year and a half at the start of that school year away from losing his oldest son, and there was probably some therapy in it for him to have his younger son on the road with him. And he introduced me at that point to Arkansas, and it began what has been a lifelong love affair with all parts of our state, including and maybe especially the rural parts of our state. And it's funny, even though I was young, how little things will blip in my mind that I vividly remember. I vividly remember having lunch, and the students were allowed to eat off campus, and I remember they had dozens of burgers cooked at a small cafe in Delight. It's funny the little things you remember. I remember pulling up at Magazine and having 3 deer run across us in the parking lot as we pulled up to the high school in Magazine. I remember sitting in an old, probably WPA-built gym in Shirley, by an actual wood stove with an actual tobacco-chewing coach sitting by it and visiting one cold winter morning. I could go on and on. I remember in the spring, when we got to the spring and it started warming up a little bit, him stopping in Caddo Gap and letting me wade in the Caddo River at Caddo Gap. So we traveled all parts of this state for a year. Some of you from the Conway area and will remember the old Tommy's restaurant. We often spent the night in Conway because there were so many schools around there. And Tommy Palladino and Johnny DeSalvo were quail hunting partners of my dad. So we'd eat every meal if we were in Conway and Tommy's. And I can remember eating my first whole trout and being screamed at by my dad, "No, you're not supposed to try to pull the eyeball out with a fork. You don't eat that part." So little things like that from that year really are great memories. And I have had this love affair with Arkansas, its people, its places ever since. Now let's fast forward to 2009. I had figured I would probably be a newspaper man my entire life, but in 2009 I was the political editor of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. We had, of course, this was during the Clinton administration, we had 3 full-time people in Washington. We had 3 full-time people at the state capitol. I supervised all 6 of them. I wrote myself. I lived here in Little Rock, but I'd average about a week a month up in Washington during the Clinton administration doing stories that our full-time people who were on daily beats really didn't have time for. But I got an opportunity to be a part of this new administration when Mike Huckabee was suddenly thrust into the governorship. And I had first met Mike when he was a radio DJ as a college student at the mighty 1240 KVRC. We were 1,000 watts during the day. At daylight, you had to go down to 200 watts, about the strength of a light bulb, and typical small town AM station. And Mike had worked there in college, and I was already working there in high school. So we had met then, but I'd really gotten to know him covering him as a journalist. His failed 92 race against Senator Bumpers, then his successful 1993 special election for lieutenant governor, full 4-year term in 94, and he was running for the Senate at the time this occurred in 96. And I'd never considered actually leaving journalism, but it sounded like an interesting opportunity to work for what would be only the 3rd Republican governor since Reconstruction. So I thought I would take a short detour into government, and that what I thought would be a short detour ended up being 13 years. I worked in the governor's office for more than 9 years, and then I was appointed by the president to something called the Delta Regional Authority, which does economic and community development in parts of 8 states, including a large part of Arkansas, and did that for 4 years. So a 13-year detour into government. And when I finally came out of government in 2009, I contacted Paul Greenberg over at the Democrat-Gazette and said, "Paul, would you be interested in another? You probably got enough columnists, but I'd like to write again." I had written a lot during those 13 years in government, but most of it was not under my name, to be honest with you, when you're working for politicians. So I was ready to write under my name again, and Paul said, "Well, let me talk to Walter Hussman." And again, I had the advantage of having worked at the newspaper in a couple of different stints for about 10 years all told. So I guess they, for some reason, trusted me, and they said, "Sure, you can start a weekly column." Now, I imagine that Paul and Walter and everybody else at the newspaper figured I'd write about politics. After all, I'd been the political editor of the newspaper. I'd worked in a governor's office. I'd worked in a presidential administration. But as I looked at that Voices page of the Democrat-Gazette, I got to thinking, boy, there's a lot of politics already here. And maybe we get a little bit more humble as we become older. And I began also to think to myself, who really cares what I think about health care reform or about this or that? I'm not sure anybody even cares what I think. I'm not sure I care what I think about some of these issues. So the readers certainly won't. So it just kind of happened that I decided a niche that I thought was missing was writing about the characters and the places and the events that make Arkansas unique, that make Arkansas, Arkansas, if you will. So I began writing about that, and I'm lucky enough that people like you have given me good feedback through the years, and I've done it. So, I'm more likely to write about quail hunting than I am, for instance, what's going on at the state capitol in that weekly column. Now, the great thing is they've never told me what to write about. I can write about anything I want to. I can write about sports one week. I can write about food the next, which is wonderful if you're a writer to be able to do that. But kind of Arkansas has become the thing that I have written about. And one thing that really strikes me with each passing year is just how different this state is than the one that I traveled with my dad from 1965 to 1966. In fact, not only are we a far different state than we were then, we're a much different state than we were even 10 years ago. And I don't want to say that I deal in nostalgia. I try to look to the future. My column that will run tomorrow morning's about Pine Bluff and some efforts to bring back Pine Bluff. That's looking to the future, not necessarily to the past. So I try to look to the future also, but I do try to capture some of those things, whether it's a rural restaurant or some river rat living on a houseboat, or the things that I think that we may be losing in Arkansas and that we may be losing at a pretty fast rate. Like I said, it's a far different state than it was just a few years ago. In fact, we've undergone two what I would consider really revolutions over the past few years. One, of course, is the political revolution, and again, I'm not here to talk about politics, but do consider the fact, and I know we've got Democrats, Republicans, and independents, all three in the room, but do consider the fact what has happened from the end of 2010 to the start of 2017, and it just boggles your mind if you look at the long history of Arkansas, how fast it happened. That in that period, we went from a congressional delegation that was 5-1 Democratic to one that's 6-0 Republican, that we went from all 7 statewide constitutional officers being Democrats to all 7 being Republicans, that we went from one of the most heavily Democratic legislatures in the country to one of the most heavily Republican legislatures in the country. As recently as 6 years ago, at the start of this period, if you had told me you will live to see the day when 76 of the 100 House members will be Republicans, I would have said you were smoking something that's soon to be legal here in Arkansas. It's just mind-boggling how quickly that has happened. Whether you agree with the trend or not, that's a revolution. I think there's an even more important revolution that's going on, though, and that is the demographic revolution. And when I say demographic, I'm not talking so much about how much people make or who they are as where they live. And what we are seeing is we are seeing a population shift in Arkansas. Population density, and with population density follows business power, follows political power from south and east to north and west. Now, as you well know, because you wouldn't be here today unless you cared about Arkansas, I don't think, and knew our state, this is a trend that's been going on since at least 1950, but the thing is it has sped up since the turn of the century. I marked down 1950 because I'm weird enough to enjoy census figures, and if you look at the 1950 census, certainly the 1940 census, you'll find that was the high water mark for a lot of Delta counties. Mississippi County has about half the population it had in the 1950 census. Phillips County, about half the population it had in the 1950 census. Lee County, Mariana. Lee County was formed right after the Civil War, so the first census done in Lee County was 1870. Care to guess which one was the smallest population in the history of Lee County? 2010, the most recent census. Smaller now than it was when the county was created after the Civil War. So 1950 becomes kind of the dividing line when Arkansas really started to change as to where people lived. And that came about, of course, largely because of the mechanization of agriculture. If you owned a cotton plantation in East Arkansas before World War II, let's say it took 200 sharecroppers and tenant farmers to raise that crop of cotton every year because you had to have them out there hoeing the cotton. You had to have the choppers out there by the hundreds in the summer, chopping cotton to keep the weeds out, and then they were picking it by hand in the fall. Now, along came the mechanized cotton picker, but not only that, also came improved insecticides, improved herbicides, where you didn't need so many people chopping in the summers anymore. And this technological revolution occurred in agriculture, and suddenly, by the 1950s, what had once taken you 200 people, you could do with 20 people. Now you can farm that same amount of land and get record yields with 2, maybe 3 people that once took 200. So you saw tens of thousands of people in the eastern half of the state suddenly with no work. Now, in the post-war years, of course, the automobile industry was booming, the steel industry was booming, as so many Americans came back, became the first in their family to go to college on the GI Bill, graduated, started raising families, bought houses, bought cars, so you could find work in places like Detroit and Chicago and Erie, Pennsylvania. Now you add the loss of jobs to the evils of segregation, and of course Arkansas was a large part of the Great Migration also of African Americans. But Arkansas had been losing population for a while. We know, of course, a lot, people across the country know a lot about the Okies, for instance, because John Steinbeck wrote about them in the Grapes of Wrath, but there were as many Arkies as there were Okies. My paternal grandmother would talk about her father who went to California in search of work in the 1930s, and she never saw him again. And she had this old faded photo, I remember, of an orange grove where he was buried, and she would lament. She wouldn't fly, so she never got out there. As she would love to visit his grave sometime. So he was one of the Arkies. So we'd seen the Great Flood of 27, we'd seen the drought of 30, 31, and we'd started losing population, not only in the Delta, but poor whites in the mountain areas of the state. Then it sped up, and many of you may not realize that from 1940 to 1960, Arkansas lost a greater percentage of its population than any state in the Union from 1940 to 1960. So we were bleeding population as a state. So as I traveled the state with my dad in that 65, 66 school year, we were still a poor, highly rural state that had been bleeding population for a number of years, and there were a number of things, whether they were country stores or whatever, that still existed then that don't exist anymore. Now, I mentioned to you, and I'll throw out just a few figures to kind of drive this home, and I can tell you that all of these trends will continue when the 2020 census finally comes out. But between 2000 and 2010, let me throw some figures out at you. Monroe County, Brinkley, Clarendon, where I duck hunt, a lot of great friends, spend time this time of year over there. Monroe County from 2000 to 2010 lost 21% of its population. That's in just a 10-year period. Now, I can assure you that trend has continued, so I'd estimate at least 25% population loss since the turn of the century. That's 1 in every 4 people. Think about it. That's stunning when you think about it. 1 in every 4. Now, compare that to Benton County, which during that same 10-year period gained 44.3% population. That trend has continued. It's more than 50% bigger now than it was at the turn of the century. Pulaski County, where we are today, where I call home, we had solid growth during that 10-year period, 5.9%, but that paled in comparison to the surrounding counties. Faulkner County, second fastest growing county in the state. I'll ask people, what was second? Benton County's first, what was second? A lot will say Washington, somewhere in northwest Arkansas. Actually, it was here in central Arkansas. Faulkner County, 31.6%. That's now over 40% growth since the turn of the century. Conway, 65,000 people. And I mentioned the old Tommies. I still think of Conway, of that city of about 15,000 that was kind of comparable to the college town of Arkadelphia that I grew up in. No longer. 31.6%. Saline County, with all the growth around Brighton, Benton, 28.2%. Lonoke County, 29.4% with all of the growth around Cabot. And yet, let's go due south. Let's go to an adjoining county, to Lonoke County. Let's go to Jefferson County. Jefferson County, which is, you're really getting into the true Delta, culturally, socially, and every other way when you go there. Jefferson County lost 8.1% of its population at a time when Lonoke County was gaining 29.4%. Pine Bluff did even worse as a city where the company I work for, Simmons Bank, is headquartered, losing 11% of its population. That's probably now 15% since the turn of the century. And so the way I tell people to imagine this is to imagine that there's this giant magnet just to the north and west of Arkansas. Let's put it about Joplin, Missouri. And it's pulling our population density from south and east to north and west. And I don't see any end to that trend. So Arkansas will continue to change because of where people live, where the business power is, and where the political power is. I probably write an inordinate amount of columns about South Arkansas and East Arkansas just because, again, I'm trying to capture some of those things that I'm not sure will be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Arkansas is a rapidly changing state. Arkansas, and if this makes sense to you, Arkansas is now, as we become more urbanized, we're now more Cabot than we are Forest City. We're now more Bryant than we are Camden, if you see what I mean. And Central Arkansas, I think, will continue to do well. I think Northwest Arkansas will continue to do well. But large parts of our state are going to continue to have their challenges as people go to where the jobs are. The fact of the matter is, as sad as it makes me as somebody who loves Arkansas history, there are hundreds of communities in this state, hundreds, that were really based on that old sharecropping and tenant farming system of agriculture. And you've been there. Some of you may have grown up in some of these places. And you talk to the old timers there, and they say, man, you should have seen it back on Saturday nights when all the stores would stay open until 10 o'clock at night. And people would flood the streets. Well, of course they would, because there were thousands of tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and Saturday was that one day they could come to town and buy their supplies, and if they had a little bit of money left over, they might eat out occasionally. Only time of the week they'd eat out, but Saturday night might get a sandwich downtown, might even go to the movie downtown. Now, frankly, for a lot of those places, there is really no longer any economic reason for them to continue to exist. And because there is not an economic reason for them to continue to exist, they will eventually cease to exist. So is Arkansas a better state or a worse state than it was when I traveled it in 1965, 66 as that young boy with my dad? I do think certainly that we have stemmed the population loss. We've actually gained population in the last few census. So in that sense, we're a better state. Our standard of living is much higher. In that sense, we're a better state. But there are certain things that we are losing. There are characters that we're losing. There are certain events that can no longer go on. I love to speak to civic clubs because they kind of put me at the heart of a town. But so many now of the small town Rotary clubs and so many of the Lions clubs that I go to, the average age of those club members is probably 70 to 75 years old. And you wonder, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will that club even exist at all? I'm not sure it will. So in many ways, we are becoming two states within a state. We're becoming a more highly urbanized central Arkansas and northwest Arkansas with a rural Arkansas out there as another state. And my hope going forward is that somehow we can unify those two disparate parts and remain Arkansas. You know, when I worked in the governor's office, one of the things that would so frustrate me is occasionally I would hear legislators say things like, and again, I ended up working for the Delta Regional Authority, so I already felt strongly about this subject, but they'd say things like, well, if we could just saw about 15 counties over there along the Mississippi River off, we'd be so much higher in all these national rankings. And I would want to scream at them, and I would say, you know, if we sawed off those 15 counties, we wouldn't be Arkansas anymore. Because the Delta, the Ozarks, the Ouachitas, the pine forest of the Gulf Coastal Plain, the Arkansas River Valley, Crowley's Ridge, they're all integral in making this state the unique place it is. We need all of them to truly be Arkansas. And the other thing I wanted to say to those people is, you know, 100 years ago when the state capitol building was new and the political power of the state was in the eastern half of the state, I bet you anything there were legislators walking these halls saying, man, if we could just saw off about 15 of those Ozark counties up there in northwest Arkansas, we would be so much better off as a state. You can't grow cotton up there, that old rocky land. All that grows is cedar trees, and no good. And Lord knows, nobody's ever going to become a millionaire raising chickens, are they? Nobody had ever heard the name Tyson back then. So things change. But it takes all of that to be Arkansas. So one of my hopes going forward is that I certainly hope that we don't become two states within a state. And I think there are some things that we need to do to prevent that from happening. For one thing, I think we need to educate our children better about Arkansas. We have a fascinating history, a fascinating story in this state. And I know, and this is a whole talk and maybe a whole panel discussion and debate for another day, I know how overwhelmed our teachers are with mandates. But I got to tell you, I think a lot of other states do a better job of teaching their state's history, its geography, its culture than we do to our own children here in Arkansas. My wife's a Texan, and I love making fun of arrogant Texans. I mean, I grew up in the old Southwest Conference era, where you hated on Texas 365 days a year. I mean, I had one of those old bumper stickers on my bedroom door that some of you may remember this. It said, "No fruit sucks like the big orange of Texas." It's on my bedroom door. I like to kid my wife about being a Texan and how lucky I was to rescue her from there, and how lucky she was that I rescued her from there and brought her to Arkansas. But that's one thing they certainly do better. I think their kids, you know, don't mess with Texas. And they know that Texas history and they have pride in it. And I fear that most of our kids, even the smart ones, even at the high school level, if I were to go to a high school in Mountain Home and I would say, point out where Forest City is, or point out where Pine Bluff, even a large place, is, that most of them probably couldn't get close on a map. Or if I were to go to McGee and say, even point out where Bentonville is, I'm not sure they could get close on a map. I'm not sure they know much about Arkansas. So that's important. The other thing that is important is to educate those who are moving here more about our state. I recently spoke to a group in northwest Arkansas, and most of them were part of the Walmart vendor community, and that's been a great thing because it's brought thousands of new Arkansans here. But I was amazed at how little they knew about anything south of the Bobby Hopper Tunnel. I had people, it's a true story, I had people wide-eyed, and they'd lived here 5 or 6 years already, but tell me about this Little Rock. We were thinking about coming down. Is there anywhere to stay? Where should we eat? Are you sure we'll be safe if we come down there? So, you know, we've got to do a better job at getting our getting our newcomers to learn about Arkansas and maybe appreciate some of those areas they don't know about. And maybe, again, that's part of why I write a lot about East Arkansas and South Arkansas for my friends up there in the great Northwest who are new to our state. So, yeah, economically, we probably are headed to be two states within a state. But again, I hope there are things that will hold us together. You know, things that have traditionally held us together is, and I'm going to show my biases on these. One, as an old sports writer, the Razorbacks traditionally held us together as a state. Now, they haven't been doing too well in football in the last few years, or maybe a little better in basketball right now. But that's something, with all due respect to my friends, and I'm an ASU fan too, but that's something that held us together. And this is another talk for another day, but it's one of those reasons I think keeping a football presence in Little Rock is so important, because it's a cultural thing for our state more than it is just an athletic event. It's something that helps tie other parts of our state together, and I'm not sure our current administration there really understands that. And again, that's another debate for another day. But that's something that traditionally has held our state together. I once visited with Frank Broyles, and I found it interesting when he said that he thought probably one of the most important things that ever happened at the University of Arkansas was when it began offering its football broadcast free to any station that wanted to carry them. And they could turn around and sell the advertising and keep the money. Because before that, large parts of far South Arkansas, they associated probably more with the LSU football program. East Arkansas, Ole Miss. West Arkansas, Oklahoma. So that brought us together as a state. I think a strong governor helps bring us together as a state. And that's one area I want to say we've had a pretty good run. From Winthrop Rockefeller up to the present, both Democrats and a Republican, I think we've had a pretty good run of governors for a small state. You look at it, and then you look at other states, like a much larger, richer Illinois, where it seems to be preordained you're going to federal prison when you leave the governor's office. That's just part of the deal. You look at the history of Illinois politics, or our friends to the south in Louisiana who thrive on corruption. It's a sport to them, right up there with Tiger football, political corruption. But we've been lucky to have a run of really good governors. And I would attend a lot as a governor staffer, and before that as a newspaper man, National Governors Association meetings. And I would listen to governors from other states speak and think to myself, how on earth did he or she get elected? They're awful. And then I realized how spoiled I was, because I grew up in an Arkansas of Dale Bumpers and a Bill Clinton and a Mike Huckabee, world-class orators from this small state, and maybe I was spoiled. So I think a strong governor, and even though our current governor comes from the far northwest corner of the state, I think he's doing a pretty good job of spending time in East Arkansas and South Arkansas and understanding the state as a whole. So that's important. I also think, and again, you may cast me as an old dinosaur here, but I also think that a strong statewide newspaper is important to hold us together. I wanted to become a newspaperman early on because I grew up on the old Arkansas Gazette. And my morning started by running into my driveway and peeling the rubber band off that newspaper and really devouring the columns and the stories in the Gazette, and taking pride in knowing that people in other states were saying one of the great newspapers in the country was in my little home state. And if you look at shrinking newspapers all across the country, I would tell you, and you may have your differences time to time for this paper that I freelance a column for. I haven't worked there full time since 1996, but we are pretty fortunate again here in Arkansas to have a strong statewide newspaper in an era when that's almost become a thing of the past. I'm an old newspaper junkie who used to buy newspapers everywhere I went, and I recently could not find a Memphis Commercial Appeal to buy out of a box in Marion. That's how right across the river. That's how most newspapers are shrinking, just back into their cities. But there does seem to be a commitment, and that's why I try to write about the whole state of our statewide newspaper. So our Razorbacks, our governor, our statewide newspaper, maybe those will be things that will tend to hold us together as a state. And I hope, again, things that won't change, as even where we live in the state changes, what we do for a living changes, as our politics changes, I hope we remain a place where roots are important. My roots are certainly, as Skip alluded to, important to me, and where families are important. My story is probably like some of yours. My father grew up poor in Arkansas. I mentioned my grandfather was the street commissioner, and my father has memories of going out with his older brother and his older sister at 5 a.m. every Sunday. And why was he being driven out of bed at 5 a.m. every Sunday? It's because, as I mentioned, people used to come to town on Saturday night. And my grandfather was charged with cleaning up the square around the Saline County Courthouse in Benton. And he had child labor to help him with that. 3 of his own children. So regardless of the weather, every Sunday morning they would go up and they would make sure every piece of trash, every bottle, every can, every piece of paper was picked up before people started arriving for Sunday school at those churches that were near that square in downtown Benton. My father probably never would have gone to college if he had not received a football scholarship from Ouachita, which may have something to do with my love of sports. My grandmother would tell the story about how my father had gotten a job. He graduated from high school in 1942. World War I had started, and we needed aluminum production, and so there was a speed up to build the aluminum plants at bauxite to supply that war effort. And my dad got a job with a company called the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company. And as an 18-year-old, they paid him union wages, and he was making far more than his father had ever made. And so he tells my grandmother, I'm going to stay on with Chicago Bridge and Iron and not go to college. She insisted he go to Ouachita for a visit. Nobody had their own cars in those days. And she loved telling the story of how she called the coach there, Bill Walton, and said, "Don't let him come home." And so Bill Walton basically kidnapped my father. My father later would leave school, serve in the Army Air Corps as a bombardier on a B-17 for 2 years, and then he would come back to Arkansas, finish school, met my mother there, married her, became a coach at Newport, and then after a few years in Newport as head football coach, decided he wanted to go in the sporting goods business. But I think my family story is a lot like, probably, again, a lot of you in this room, your family stories. So the other thing that I hope that we don't lose in Arkansas is not only that sense of place, not only that sense of history of a very unique state, but that sense of family. And I'm not only talking our nuclear family, I'm talking our Arkansas family, because in a state of only about 3 million people, I do still feel that we are one big family. With that, I'll shut up and I'll be glad to answer any questions should you have them. Thank you for being here today.
Okay, we got questions. Yes, right back here.
Thanks for coming, Rex.
Thanks, Carol.
I wanted to ask you, all the changes in demographics, which usually results in redistricting, does that mean that we lose more identity and representation of these parts of Arkansas as we're redistricted and the representation changes?
Well, obviously, every 10 years we're going to see what we've been seeing, and that is geographically, the 4th district will grow larger. The 1st congressional district will grow larger, the 2nd district will shrink, and the 3rd district will shrink. Now, when I was growing up again, the 4th district was traditionally the South Arkansas district. Now it reaches almost to Fayetteville, as you know. The 1st congressional district was the Delta district. Now it contains a number of mountain counties in it. So that is going to continue to be the case with that population shift that I'm talking about. And again, that does have implications, as those congressmen are faced to or have to carry a larger and larger part of the area. Now one thing I do want to say, and I make this point sometimes when I speak to agricultural groups, and certainly when I was with Delta Regional Authority, I would make this point. You know, we tend to focus on the population loss, and everybody says, "Oh Lord, the poor old Delta." Well, again, most of that population loss is not based on some plague that came through, a bunch of locusts that flew through. It's based on our farmers being so dadgum good at what they do. I mean, we still have the best farmers in the world, a lot of them, right here in Arkansas. So while there will be less people living in the eastern half of the state, that land is going to become, or it's going to still be as valuable or more valuable than it has ever been. It's just going to take less people to produce on it. But agriculture, certainly for the rest of the lifetime of everybody in this room, is going to continue to be a huge part of the Arkansas economy. And I hope, again, going back to educating our own people, I hope, again, as we become more urbanized and where people live, we don't lose sight of that, how important it is to the state.
Any other questions? Yes, right about here, Carney.
Carney?
That area.
Yeah, I wrote a column, it was headlined a couple of weeks ago, Lessons from Memphis, and it had some lessons from Little Rock too, but I used Jonesboro as an example there. Jonesboro is an exception. Paragould, certainly, Craighead, and Greene County, which are just booming. I was just up there on Monday of last week. And the thing that has happened there is that they have become true regional, Jonesboro has become a true regional center. What you used to see in that whole quadrant of the state, and many of you, again, are from Northeast Arkansas, so you know this better than anyone, is that people would go to Memphis to go to the doctor. They would go to Memphis to shop. They would go to Memphis for entertainment. They'd go to Memphis to eat out. Through the years, that has changed. We've got the huge new Northeast Arkansas Baptist Hospital. We got St. Bernard's growing. So now they all, from all these communities in that whole quadrant, go to Jonesboro to go to the doctor. They go to Jonesboro to eat out. They go to Jonesboro to shop. And that's why it is really booming at Northwest Arkansas growth rates, to be honest with you. But you get within a 50-mile radius, and there are a lot of small communities, again, back to what I'm talking about, that are really, really struggling. And that goes back to the urbanization of Arkansas.
Yes, ma'am. Back here in the back. Can we get the microphone? Hold on, ma'am.
Oh, my voice does carry. So speaking of actual numbers and statewide population, is there a census at which the statewide population was more than it is now?
No.
No, okay.
No,
okay.
we are growing. In fact, from 2000 to 2010, I don't think we'll rate quite as high this time. The growth has been pretty slow since 2010. But from 2000 to 2010, we were in the top half of states percentage-wise in growth, 25, in the top 25. And that says something, again, for the state, again, that lost a higher percentage of its population from 1940 to 1960 than any other state.
Revis, right here.
Revis.
Hold on, wait for the microphone. And you
Great.
talk about the 1990 gubernatorial election. He had a little bit to do.
Do you see a time in our lifetime where our population may increase at such a tick that we could possibly pick up a 5th congressional seat?
When you look at the growth of other states that are growing faster than we are, I don't see it on the horizon. It could happen that we, at some point, we're fairly close. It could happen that we get that 5th congressional seat, but I don't see it anywhere soon. It's not going to happen in the next census, and probably won't happen 10 years after that either.
Okay, I know there are more questions, but for the sake of time and for the fact that you all need to come over and purchase Southern Fried, which is, by the way, according to Gene, Wordsworth's #1 seller.
Oh, thank
so,
you.
Which is a good thing. I want to welcome our friends from the Department of Arkansas Heritage, from Parks and Tourism that are here. And Rex, I want to say, I want you to check your population numbers, because there's a little town that you and I both hold dear, near Jonesboro, called Newport. And I believe that in the last census, Newport held its own and actually gained population.
I will end with one story, and I've got two on this now. I think you all will appreciate this because it goes back to what a small state we are in Arkansas. My father graduates from college in 1948, is offered the job as coach. My mother's a fifth grade teacher at Newport, and they moved to Newport, and the guy running the Ben Franklin store in downtown Newport was a fellow named Sam Walton. Sam Walton figured out my dad was a huge bird hunter. And as you know, Mr. Sam loved to hunt quail. And so he would regularly take the new coach out to hunt for that first year that Dad lived in Newport. Then he lost his lease, you may know, on that Ben Franklin store, got to looking for another place, found some cheap property way up northwest Arkansas at Bentonville. And years later, true story, I would ask my dad, why didn't you keep that relationship going? Could you not have at least traded Christmas cards or something? He said, I lost track of him. Look, if Dad had kept that relationship going and bought some of the stock in that initial public offering, I wouldn't be writing or doing anything else right now. Small state, small, wonderful state.
Come visit with Rex and buy his book. Thank you all.
Thank y'all. I'm honored you came today.